Hey there, church family. This is our next week in our journey through the Israelites and how they got to and from Egypt. And this week we'll draw heavily into next week as well. So this is kind of a two-parter. But today we're going to talk about foundations and how that affects us and ministry and how we can speak to different generations. Let's start today with Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 to chapter 2, verse 10. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase and, in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it, and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, I drew him out of the water. Now let us turn to Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, Who do you say the Son of Man is? And they said, Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, But who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered, You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So something that I really enjoy is generational theory. I have an interest of the generational studies. Generational theory says that about every 20 years there will be a new generation that has an identity to it, that you'll see a common theme in how people act and who they are. And the reason I love generational studies so much is it's probably the history lover in me, but I enjoy seeing the different personalities of generations and trying to figure out the context around why a generation acted the way it acted. One of the first named generations is the Lost Generation. They are born between 1883 and 1900. And they were teenagers during World War I. Some of them would have probably fought in World War I. And some of these dates are debated among different people that study generational theory, but the Lost Generation is called the Lost Generation because they were raised with a worldview that quickly changed during World War I. And the last pandemic before COVID-19, the Spanish flu, it had happened during their adolescence as well, in their younger adulthood. And they had to raise families during the Great Depression. So they were raised with this worldview that did not prepare them for the world that they actually entered. And you'll see the other generations here on this slide, but the greatest generation, it was born around 1901 to 1924. The silent generation was born between 1925 and 1945. The baby boomers from 1946 to 1964. And then Generation X, 1965 to 1980. Millennials, which I am a millennial, was born between 1981 and 1996. And Gen Z, Generation Z, 1997 to 2012. Those are your teenagers today and your people in your 20s. And Generation Alpha is the newest generation. They're still being born, starting around 2013 to the present. And Generation Alpha is really debated when it starts and when Gen Z stops, but we'll probably have a better idea as Generation Alpha ages. As I said, some of these years are debated, but that's the main gist of it. But the idea of generational studies and generational theory is that different generations have different identities because of the historical events they face and the way they were raised. But there are some cyclic trends due to history repeating itself as well. As I said, the Lost Generation. They were raised in a world that no longer existed after World War I. The world was completely different. Baby boomers, they were raised in World War II America. Post-World War II America, there was a big boom in the economy, and they had a lot of things that were given to them that were not given to prior generations, such as wealth and free time and things like that. But they're the first age group to really appreciate the concept of being a kid and having a teen culture. You saw the rise of James Dean and Elvis and the Beatles. Woodstock was the marquee event. But also, there was political upheaval with the civil rights movement, the Red Scare, Watergate, Vietnam. There were riots, such as there were some racial riots, but also the Weathermen and the Days of Rage in Chicago. So one of the interesting things about generational studies is we're seeing parallels between then and now. I am personally, as I said, a millennial, and I laugh when people still blame, oh, these millennial kids, when actually we're all in our 30s and 40s. But we grew up like the Lost Generation in a way, because when September 11th, 2001 happened, the world changed. It was never the same. How we were raised was different than the world that we were coming into. During my entire teenage years, there were wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and what's called the War on Terror. The Great Recession, it hit us as we're hitting adulthood. I was in college when the Great Recession started, and it was a little scary wondering, well, what world is going to wait for me as I'm trying to get a job? We're trying to buy homes as the housing market is crashing. Oh, baby boomers, they make fun of Gen Z, but there are a lot of parallels between those two generations. As I said, the racial upheaval, mistrust of the government, riots on the news every day. Generation Z is growing up very similarly in that atmosphere of the baby boomers. If you look around, Gen Z is seeking spirituality as baby boomers had sought spirituality. There was the Jesus movement, there was the revival at Asbury Theological Seminary. This world is hurting, and these kids are looking for somewhere to turn to. But I look at these generations, and the one that I probably admire the most is the greatest generation, because they earned their name, greatest generation. These were people raised during the Great Depression. They went and they fought in World War II. I mean, that was one tough generation. My Pap Gallagher, as these pictures are of him, he grew up in a cabin in Appalachia during the Great Depression. When he was born, they really didn't, there was no birth certificate. I've seen the year 1921, 1922, and 1924 on his personal paperwork. So we have a lot of mystery there as he was born in this small cabin in Appalachia. He grew up with nothing. A candy bar was a gold bar to him as a kid. During Christmas, if it was a good year, he would get an orange with his candy bar. That was a good year. So when World War II broke out, he enlisted on July 23rd, 1942. Because, well, he really didn't have any other options in life. And he felt this call to defend his country after Pearl Harbor. When that happened, he heard it on the radio, and he went and thought about it, and he enlisted in July. So this man, he had probably never really left Pennsylvania before. He gets on a train, goes to Texas to train in the Chemical Corps, and then he boards a ship for the Philippines. On March 35th, 1944 is when he officially started active duty abroad and did not come home until January 14th, 1946. He never had what we consider a childhood experience. He was working at orchards and at a tannery in Mercersburg from a young age, and he had a hard life. He loved animals, he loved children, because I think he experienced enough darkness in his life, and he wanted to appreciate things that were pure and full of love and hope. But as you see here, here's some pictures of my grandfather at as he was graduating training camp, and that one on the left there is him in the Philippines. So as we continue our journey through Israel and their time in Egypt, I want you to think about where things come from. What's the foundation? What experiences shape who people are and how they view the world? Because Israel had entered Egypt a hero with Joseph, but we're going to find out that it didn't stay that way. Generational studies are at work here, as the Egyptians had forgotten how the Hebrew people got there. In Egypt, over time, Joseph was forgotten, the Israelite population grew, and this intimidated the Egyptian pharaoh. He had feared the Israelites and their uprising that could happen. There was a war, he said, they're going to rise against us. So they forced the Hebrew people into labor and they built supply cities. Now, some people will say, oh, there's no evidence of this, but you don't need to look any farther than the Papyrus of Brooklyn. And that gives us the names of 95 Egyptian slaves. You'll see a picture of it on the left there, one of those papyruses. But 30 have Semitic names, and 9 have specific Hebrew names. Then the rule of Hyksos in the 18th dynasty, that also is proof that it made non-Egyptian people into forced laborers. So the Israelite population, it continues to grow. And the instruction came to the midwives. If there's a male that's born, kill him. But if it's a female, let her live. So the midwives, they're Hebrew and they love God, but they still let the boys live. And they gave the excuse, hey, these women, they're popping out kids before we can even get there. So God blesses them. And the Pharaoh, he commands that all baby boys should be thrown into the Nile. He's like, all right, if they're popping them out that quick, let's just throw them into the water and they can be crocodile bait. So the mother, she did not want her son thrown into the Nile, of course. And she takes this basket, she plasters it with bitumen and pitch, and that's so it wouldn't leak. It made it buoyant, and she placed that basket among the reeds. Then she has her daughter stand by. So Pharaoh's daughter, she finds this baby among the reeds. She takes pity on him, and the baby's sister, Miriam, she had been watching, and she wanted to see what was going to happen with Moses. And she says, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse this child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said yes. So Miriam goes, gets her mother, reunites this baby with its mother, which that's amazing, that's precious. And the Pharaoh's daughter names the child Moses because she drew him out of the water. God had saved Moses from the horrors of the Nile. First from the command to be thrown in it, then from the dangers of the crocodiles and other animals that were looking for something to eat. So God continues to save through the Messiah. A baby is born, threatened by a king, just like Moses. And the beautiful part is, here's a connection that comes in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to 15. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child and destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." So the Old Testament Joseph found refuge in Egypt as he was sold into slavery. Moses had to escape Egypt. Then Jesus returns for refuge. Then Jesus returns from Egypt to once again free the Israelite people, but not in the way the Israelites expected. We see the confusion here in Matthew 16 as Jesus asked his people, "Who is the Son of Man?" The disciples are there and they start throwing out some answers of what various people speculated: John the Baptist and Elijah, Jeremiah, the other prophets. There's a lot of speculation, but there's no concrete answers from the Israelite people. So Jesus asked his disciples, "Well, who do you say I am?" Peter said, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus told Peter that he was blessed for having this knowledge imparted on him. And since he recognized that Jesus was the Messiah, the church would build up from this knowledge. Well, Peter's actually recognized as the first leader of the church, prominent in the book of Acts. The Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, they actually both have him as the beginning of the apostolic succession. The Pope is actually the successor of Peter. So the office of the Pope today is still connected to Peter. And we see here a painting from 1468 of Peter with the key to the kingdom of heaven and the Bible there. He is building up the church with his knowledge. And we see Jesus in the middle there handing the key off at a church there. And so Jesus told them, "I don't want you to share this message yet." They still had a lot to learn from this point, but their teacher was not done teaching, and Peter would go on to spread the gospel after he has these lessons to learn. But the question is, what foundation do we have? Some of us, we have firm foundations in the church, but not everybody was raised in the church. More and more people are actually not being raised in the church. Generation Z and Generation Alpha, they are not raised in the church. But I think that we see in the Bible that it's not where you come from, it's where you go. Moses, he was not raised in a normal Hebrew life, obviously. He was raised by the Egyptians. He was raised by the very people that were exploiting his fellow Hebrews. And he was probably raised around their religions, their magicians that we see trying to replicate the plagues later in Exodus. But he was raised by Pharaoh. And that was in hopes that the Hebrew slaves would listen to a fellow Hebrew more than the Egyptian slave drivers. This is a common practice, actually. The Nazis did something similar in the concentration camps. They would get some fellow Jews, and they would be kind of the fellow, like, cabin leaders, so to speak, in the concentration camps. And also, the southern plantation owners did this with their slaves. They would pick a trusted person from the oppressed people, treat them better than the rest, and then have them as overseers at the camp, the work sites, the fields. But God called Moses. Moses was this short-tempered man who could not speak well, had a speech impediment, and used him and his brother Aaron to lead the Hebrew people out of Egypt. And Miriam, she's still in the story as well. She's actually called a female prophet in Exodus 15:20-21. So she's a female prophet. And the Bible does not use the word, or the Bible does use the word prophet for her in Micah 6:4. She is remembered with her brothers in prophecy. So Miriam actually is Mary in Greek, like the Mother Mary. There's a lot of connections there with Miriam. But Peter, he goes on to deny Jesus 3 times. Even though he was the first to recognize the Messiah, he still denied Christ 3 times. But the Holy Spirit moved him to be the first leader of the church. It's not too bad for a fisherman from the Sea of Galilee. An outcast and a blue-collar worker, they both led movements for God. Both of them had flaws. Moses killed a man, Peter denied Christ, but God takes these flawed people and uses them to do big things. The greatest generation is called the greatest generation because they started life in horrible circumstances, but they made it through. And as Generation Z and Generation Alpha have been raised in a worldwide pandemic, and the internet has raised a new slew of issues, from cyberbullying to child exploitation and a slew of other worldwide problems, I'm praying that these 2 generations answer the call in a similar manner. But I feel a conviction that we, as the older generations, yes, millennials are parents now, believe it or not, we need to guide these younger generations instead of criticizing them so much. We want to lead a movement, and leaders motivate. Leaders challenge people. Leaders lift people up. But if we're constantly berating people, if we're constantly pushing them down, we're not leading them. The only thing we're leading them to is a self-fulfilling prophecy. I want to quote our 2 leaders from this message here. Moses, he tells the Israelites in Deuteronomy 10:12-13. So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today for your own well-being. Moses was encouraging. He was saying, love God and follow the commandments. And Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5-6. In the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. And all of you must clothe yourselves with humility in your dealings with one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in due time. They're both words of wisdom. They're both teaching people to love God and follow his direction. And if we want to lead people out of Egypt, if we want to lead this generation, we need to follow God first and foremost. And then we need to clothe ourselves in humility in our dealings with one another in a multi-generational coherence. We might not understand those older or younger generations, but we will understand each other more if we take the time to see what different generations went through. We can learn from one another. And I encourage those that are younger to listen to and learn from those older generations. They've experienced a lot. There's a lot to learn. They have stories that should never be forgotten. And I encourage those that are older to listen and learn from the younger generations. They have some youthful insights, some new perspectives. They have an exuberance that should not be ignored or dismissed. The younger generations are tomorrow's leaders. It is better to encourage them to appreciate where they came from rather than to make them resent where they came from. And yes, that is a picture of Snoop Dogg as he did a gospel album, believe it or not. So, with that new understanding, we have our foundation and can rally together to lead this movement out of the land of Egypt into the promised land. You look at these pictures of different people from different walks of life. They should all come together. They should all work together. It starts with strong foundations and nourishing the future. A church movement is an intergenerational task. Are we up to following that task? Remember, God loves you. I love you. Have a blessed week and come together as different generations working together as the body of Christ. Amen.